Okay, so we are now going to begin an introductory lecture on Paradise Lost. Not really so much an introductory lecture on Paradise Lost. If you do want that, you can Google me and Milton, and you'll find a video from years back, which is more of an introduction to the entire poem. Today we will be looking at book one. And we will be reiterating some of the issues about which we've discussed already in relationship to Milton. And we will anticipate seeing the same kinds of tensions, oppositions, questions that we've seen Milton raise in his other poems, also in Paradise Lost. So, for example, we saw really from the Nativity Ode a kind of conflict between Christianity and classicism, that even as Milton rejects the pagan gods, he does represent them. And even as we leave the poem with the idea of Christian time, and certainly the last stanza of that poem reiterates that, we still have that residual feeling or the residual presence of those pagan gods. They make a big return in book one of Paradise Lost. So that's one way in which classicism and Christianity are in conflict with one another. We've seen that throughout the poems. Also, questions of time, temporality. Also in the Nativity Ode, we spoke about the relationship between two different kinds of temporality. One, which we footnote with Macbeth's tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, a meaningless sense of time unfolding without any goal. Can you relate? And the other version of time, the tick-tock version of time, in which there is a beginning clearly and an ending. And even though we find ourselves in the interval, there are three parts to this model, even though we find ourselves in the interval, we still do have a hope of things to come, as Augustine says. Milton plays with both of these notions of time in Nativity Ode, and we'll see it again here. The third thing, we'll talk about poetic voice, interiority, independence. We saw that clearly in Comus as the lady develops she represents to us and to herself a notion of the self, which is independent, which is dependent upon an interior world, which is not dependent on the exterior world. Remember, she's frozen to her seat, and still she exercises freedom. So we'll see that. We've seen Milton's representation of his own voice throughout his poetry, the idea to be first, to do something that no one else has yet done. We'll see that again, of course, here in Paradise Lost in the Invocation. And finally, the last thing that I do want to mention at a little bit greater length right now is Milton's status as a kind of Christian midrashist. I've been reading over the weekend my three favorite midrashim on Genesis. One is Thomas Mann's Joseph and His Brothers, which is an amazing book. The other is Paradise Lost, and the third is Midrash, is the rabbinic genre of Midrash. So a little bit about that. What is the rabbinic genre of Midrash? Why is it so prominent in rabbinic literature? Why is there so much of it? What is its function, and how do you read it? So I think for the rabbis, heresy alert here, I'm not really sure yet. I'm not sure what I'm going to say yet. I think for the rabbis, the biblical text is an occasion for them to interpret the text. Mann says in Joseph and His Brothers that some people like merely the fairy tale, but the better version, and he means times 1,000, the better version is through commentary. And rabbinic commentary shares with Mann a sense of what its status as poetry as commentary, which is the really kind of strange thing about Midrash, that it's not only interpretation, and it is that. It is, and this, I go back to this all the time, and I'm kind of satisfied with this metaphor. It is an interpretive lens on the Bible, each Midrash, and there are many different interpretive lenses on the same story in the Bible. The interpretive lenses that are supplied are usually narrative. So you have a version of interpretation of poetry which is itself poetry. And Erich Auerbach, he writes in his book called Mimesis, which I think he wrote in Istanbul without a library in the late 1930s. talks about two kinds or two modes of writing. One mode of writing he associates with the Hebraic, the other he associates with the Greek. The one that he associates with the Greek, very, very simply, is a notion of, is a conception of representation which is based upon subordination. That is, this full of causal explanations, relative clauses on a local level, but a conception of representation that is filling out an argument. I mean, he's thinking about Homer, about the almost cinematographic representation that you get in Homer, in which everything seems to be represented. And of course, there's more work to be done in relationship to that. In any event, the Hebraic, Auerbach says, is not based upon what he refers to in the Greek mode as hypotaxis, this idea of subordination, but rather parataxis. Parataxis is a kind of writing in which causal relations are left out. And he uses the Old Testament, the Bible, the Old Testament as the prime example of this. So, for example, when we learn about Abraham's turning to God, we do not, in fact, learn about what happened. Now, any kid in a Jewish day school will tell you that the reason is because his father sold idols and he went into the shop and he broke the idols. The story is more complicated, or can get more complicated. So there's a midrash kind of moving in and supplying a motivation. When you confuse the interpretive poetry for the poetry upon which it is commenting, then you're not in a good place. Midrash, I think, in some way is an antidote to thinking about literal meanings. That is, the Midrash opens up, the Tanakh opens up the Bible to so many multiple different interpretations and perspectives. What does this have to do with Milton? So Milton had in his possession a translation of Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which is a collection of midrashim, and it was not in Hebrew, it was in Latin. People will argue about how much Hebrew he knew, and it's probably not that much, but he did certainly know Latin. So he had midrashim that were available to him. Let me just get one of my copies of Paradise Lost. Oh, so this edition of Paradise Lost, it's the how do you do this? The Fowler edition. And you can just get a sense of like the notes here. They're extensive notes. It's really kind of the scholar's edition. He really gives a lot of detail. Anyway, Fowler read a book by a neighbor of mine in Jerusalem called Milton in Midrash. Her name's Golda Werman. And even though the book did not make that much of a splash, Fowler uses it extensively, and especially in book 7 of Paradise Lost, and book 4 probably as well, where he identifies midrashim that Milton used in order to write his poem. That is, he takes the content of the midrash, we'll talk about them in book 7, and he integrates them into Paradise Lost. So that's kind of cool. I'm more interested in midrash not for its content, but for its method. And the method of midrash is, going back to Auerbach and his identification of the Old Testament as parataxis, that is, midrash is filling in the blanks. So in some ways, Milton can be thought of as a Christian midrashist. That is, he is filling in the Old Testament text in such a way that it is appropriated into his Christian sensibility. Now, in some ways, this is not unusual, insofar that methods of interpretation existed since the Church Fathers, in which one would find, I mean, I remember Augustine in his Christian Doctrine says, I think, it's a long recall, that Jesus actually whispered into the ear of Moses, and that Jesus was really present at the time of the Old Testament, and Moses knew. There will be others, like Paul and like Augustine, who take the Old Testament text, and interpret it or reinterpret it in such a way that it already does anticipate the New Testament. So Isaac being sacrificed by Abraham is a type of Jesus. So those modes of interpretation have existed for centuries. What makes Milton unusual is that status of being a midrashist. His interpretations are not through methods of reading. Of course, they're implicit, but methods of representation. Milton is writing a Christian midrash. His poetry is a poetry of commentary. So that's a cool thing, right? And we'll see that's what Milton is clearly doing, is thinking of himself, maybe not explicitly in that light, but using those methods. So on to Paradise Lost. I think that's a really good and kind of non-apologetic presentation of this, meaning this is not a Me Too-ism of some Jew someplace saying, well, oh yeah, well, Jewish people, can make a contribution. Milton was clearly using midrash as a method, and it's very, very helpful to look at Paradise Lost in that sense, especially in the sense that we're looking at understanding Paradise Lost as commentary as poetry, or poetry as commentary. I'm satisfied with that. Milton starts off the poem with an introduction to English verse. People don't often pay attention to it. We go right to the poem, and we will do that in a second, but let's just see what Milton is writing here. The measure is English heroic verse without rhyme, instead of Homer in Greek. Boom, 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 right? Classical, he's playing the classical, his classical drum set, right? If you have any doubt about what tradition I'm writing in, Milton says, I'm writing in the tradition of the classics, Homer in Greek, and Virgil in Latin. Rhyme being no necessary adjunct or true ornament of poem or good verse in longer works especially, but the invention of a barbarous age, I guess, 5th and 6th century Latin hymns. Okay, there's an implicit historiography here, or history here. Milton is writing in an age which is not characterized by barbarism, that Latin early Middle Ages, I guess, is, to set off wretched matter and lame meter, graced indeed since by the use of some famous modern poets, carried away by custom, but much to their own vexation, hindrance, and constraint, to express many things otherwise, and for the most part worse than else they would have expressed them. So even though some modern poets have done it, it's been to their detriment. Think about John Donne, who would write in a similar vein. Remember his response to Marlowe and Raleigh, Come Live With Me and Be My Love. The Bait is really a poem about poetry, and gives, and the pleasures that Marlowe and Raleigh offer are for Donne is just a mere bait. And if you just bite on that, you're missing what's far more significant. Not without cause, therefore, some both Italian and Spanish poets of prime note have rejected rhyme both in longer and shorter works. I think the Spanish poet Tasso, as have also long since our best English tragedies, Shakespeare, as a thing of itself to all judicious ears, trivial and of no true musical delight. If you're fooled by rhyme, if they give you pleasures, you're getting the wrong kinds of pleasure. It's the fairy tale pleasure, it's not the real thing, which consists only in apt numbers, fit quantity of syllables, and the sense variously drawn out from one verse into another, not in the jingling sound of like endings, a fault avoided by the learned ancients, both in poetry and in all good oratory. No jingling sounds from Milton. The neglect then of rhyme is so little to be taken for defect, though it may seem so perhaps to vulgar readers. Milton, interestingly, in the first, before he even starts the poem, is talking about the people who will misread him, vulgar readers, that it rather is to be esteemed an example set, the first in English, Milton is first. Get it all here, right? Of ancient liberty recovered to a heroic poem from the troublesome and modern bondage of rhyming. As in everything in Milton, there's just so much going on here. So the ancient liberty recovered. What is our ancient liberty, classical liberty, the liberty of the ancients, Roman liberty, Greek liberty. Milton, as we've said, is a poet of liberty, and he's saying this is distinguishing his English poem, first in English, and it's rescued from the troublesome and modern bondage of rhyming. So Milton sees a parallel between bad poetry and lack of freedom. For Shakespeare, bad poets are bad lovers. For Milton, Romeo at the beginning, Orlando at the beginning. For Milton, bad poets are bad citizens and encourage bad citizenship. I'm using citizen in a very broad sense. Okay, so that's the front matter about the verse. Let's now go forward to, and we're now in the John Milton reading room. We'll go forward to the first 26 lines of the poem, and we can read this with the knowledge that we bring to Milton from his earlier poems, the earlier things that are on his mind. And we'll see that the lenses that we have developed up until now will be useful here. And I assume most of you have read this already, not only for this class, but for in the past. Of man's first disobedience in the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe, with loss of Eden. So in the first, how many lines? 3.5 lines of the poem, we focus on man's disobedience, mortality, mortal taste, death, woe, loss. So if we're thinking in terms of that tick-tock, the tick is in the past, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. God creates the heaven. In the beginning, God creates the heaven and the earth. That's in the past here. We're in the interval, and the interval is characterized by suffering. And the key to a good theodicy, as we've been saying, is a recognition of loss, mortality, death, woe, and suffering. After the comma in the fourth line, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat, that line and a half situates us not in the middle, but already at the end. Ta-da! In some ways, Milton has already performed the work of Paradise Lost, which I think one way of looking at it is to encourage his readers to understand time better. To have his readers understand the relationship between the human perspective and the human narrative, and the divine perspective and the divine narrative. The human perspective and the human narrative, all it is that middle, the interval, and the fruit of that forbidden tree is mortal taste brought death into the world and all our woe with loss of Eden. That's the middle. Of course, there are smachot also. There are weddings and births and things like that. But for Milton, history is what hurts. Till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Sing, heavenly muse. So here Milton is invoking the muse, and in so doing, you're all nodding at home, and in so doing, showing that he is placing himself in a relationship with Homer and Virgil, because Homer and Virgil also begin their poems with invocations to the muse. As we'll see, and as we probably already expect, Milton's heavenly muse is different from the 9 muses that Homer and Virgil invoke. Or if Milton does invoke those muses, but his muse will also be distinctive. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed. In the beginning, how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos. Or if Sion Hill delight thee more in Siloa's brook that flowed fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Ionian mount while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that does prefer before old temples the upright heart and pure, instruct me, for thou knowest. Thou from the first was present, and with mighty wings outspread doves like sat brooding on the vast abyss, and made it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine. What is low, raise and support, that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. It was not till much later, the philosopher Leibniz, not much later, but I think the 18th century, the beginning of it, that the term theodicy gets used. Leibniz uses it like a very, very clunky philosopher. Of course, he was a genius. He invented calculus at the same time as Newton, but his conception of human history and its relationship to the divine is much simpler than that of Milton. Let's leave it at that for the moment. So this is a theodicy. Now let's take a moment just to think for a minute, or to bring another framework into our understanding of Milton. Critics have argued for centuries about whether Milton is of the devil's party, as William Blake claims it. Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, or as Philip Pullman says, that he was of the devil's party and he knew it. Blake says Satan, of course, gets all the best poetry, and notwithstanding whatever pedagogical and Christian energies the poem has, it's undermined, or maybe not undermined, we have to look at the Blake carefully. It's certainly complemented by this power, this strength of the figure of Satan, and the emotional and poetic pull that Satan has had on its readers. That's really the problem with the poem, is what do you do with the experience that many readers have that Satan is the most compelling figure in the poem? It's not unparalleled to what we've seen in Dr. Faustus, where Faustus's sins, as it were, his transgressions, are far more appealing than his punishment in dramatic terms. I mean, Milton raises the stakes a billion times here, so that we see, when we read Paradise Lost, and we'll see this in the first book, there are ways in which the poetic energies associated with Satan are much more, I'm not going to say appealing to us, but they draw us in. So there are those. And then there are angelic readers of the poem who want to appropriate Milton, or want to use Milton as a figure of conventional Christianity, which of course is impossible. Milton was no conventional Christian. Although with that said, people did, after they came home from church in the 19th century, they would go home and read from their copy of Paradise Lost. So it did have that function in the English imagination as a poem that was complementing the experience that was being had at church. Now, Milton's reputation was problematic from its inception because of his association with regicide. And that's not me saying he was of the devil's party without knowing it, but the whole idea that Milton's status as the writer of the great Christian epic was compromised by his association with regicide, with the killing of the king. In 1695, and we've talked about this before, an edition was put together with all of the classical references, put out in grand form and grand style, was sponsored by Whig and Tory alike, I think. Or was mostly a Whig effort. The Whigs were in power at that time, but it was an attempt really at domesticating Milton such that he could be used and understood as the great poet of England, without all of those associations with the regicide. Milton is turned into a classic, as he really is for us today, meaning most people know about Milton's Paradise Lost and don't necessarily know about his revolutionary activities, his political commitments, which were as important to him as his poetic. I mean, as we'll see, and as I think we've said so far, for Milton, the separation that we make so easily between theology and aesthetics and politics is not a separation at all. So his poetry is both theological, obviously, but also we'll see there is obviously there is a politics here. Certainly not a simple one, but there certainly is. This Paradise Lost is not only a theological statement as a title, it is also a political one. Paradise Lost, what's lost? all the energies that went into the failed revolution that ended up with Charles II returning from France and the people of England celebrating that return. So the angelic readers will naturally assert that this poem, as it claims to be, is a pedagogical exercise, the justification of the ways of God to men. And I think it's impossible to read the poem otherwise. I think it's impossible to read the poem well otherwise. In some ways, the critical camps of devils and angels has done a disservice to the poem for in asserting both sides, that one cannot both be skeptical and believe. And Milton, if nothing else, is a skeptical believer. And part of that skeptical belief means for Milton that in order to go up, just like Joseph and his brothers, in order to go up, you have to first go down. Did Mann read Freud? He actually did. Did Milton read Freud? No. He provided Freud with the material for Freud. In order to go up, you first have to go down. What in me is dark, illumine. What is low, raise and support. Amazing that to the height of this great argument, his poem, I may assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. Our whole reading of Paradise Lost is based upon the assumption that Milton is trying to teach. Oh my God, right? The idea that the poet is trying to teach and create a readership for his poem. Because by creating a readership for his poem, he's creating a community, a culture, a civilization. I mean, a civilization in exile, basically, because Charles II is in power. So that's my assumption, that Milton is trying to teach and that he, wait for it, is successful at teaching, and not because of the failure in his representation of Satan as this tempting, sensual source of energy, but precisely because of that. That Milton succeeds as a writer of theodicy because of the power of Satan. That was clarifying. That it's possible to look at the poem and to understand that the focus on human suffering and evil, and on the other side, the focus on the possibility of glory and selfhood, are not independent of the pedagogy of Paradise Lost, but are very much part of it. And Milton, for example, will use Satan as a means of distinguishing between genuine subjectivity and a form of narcissistic subjectivity. Let's go back to the beginning. Just pull and come back to some of the things with which we started. Singh having used it on the secret top, a later editor changes it to sacred. He doesn't like secret. How can the place of revelation be secret? Kabbalists among you will certainly identify that revelation and concealment come together. Of Oreb, Chorev, or of Sinai, didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning. I love that. That's this appropriation of the Bible of Genesis. In the beginning, how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos. Milton, as we've said already, the English poet of the greatest chutzpah imaginable, in the beginning, how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos. First of all, for just the appropriation of that first line and putting it in his poetry, and also for the chutzpah of taking a story that we all already know. Milton collected many dozens of possible topics for his epic, and he decided finally on Genesis. With my undergraduates, we go through the thought experiment and wonder, if you were a friend of Milton, what would you have told him if he said, hey, I have this great idea for a poem? How about the beginnings of man and of man? And if you were a good friend, you would say to Milton, hey, dude, it's already been done. but there is that here, that's, I think there's another sign of Milton's chutzpah, that he chose this. He could have done Arthurian legend. I read about a couple last night, which I'm not remembering right now, but minor, certainly less significant stories in the biblical narrative. But he goes right for Genesis. Who is that shepherd? First we note or of Sinai, two names for the same place. That shepherd, of course, that's Moses here, who first taught the chosen seed. So here we have this Hebraic, even as he's saying, sing heavenly muse, suddenly we're not in the landscape of the Greek, but rather in the landscape of the Hebraic, the Old Testament. In the beginning, how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos. Or now we're in Jerusalem, the Sion hill, delight thee more, and Siloah is brook Shiloh that flowed fast by the oracle of God. So notice Milton's, we start with the Christian, the first 5 lines, the Greek, sing heavenly muse, Oreb, Sinai, chosen seed, in the beginning, Sion, Siloah, and then the oracle of God. So it's kind of confusing, this confusing set of generic signals. And Milton is telling us, really, when we're reading this poem, this is a different, this is not what you expect. That flowed fast by the oracle of God. So simultaneously, this poem will have affiliations, associations with the Greek, Latin, Homer and Virgil, as we started out with, but also Sion. I then invoke thy aid to my adventurous song. What does adventurous mean here? Blah, blah, blah. My adventurous song, probably an idea of a song that's going beyond the bounds of what's expected, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Ionian Mount. This Milton, there is a low style, high style, a middle style, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Ionian Mount. Even though Siloah's brook somehow in his weird geography flows fast by the oracle of God, his poetry, Milton's poetry, is in soaring above the Ionian Mount while it pursues things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. Attention, everybody, I'm doing something that's never been done before. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, who is this that Milton is calling out to here? Likely the muse, though we're not used to hearing the muse referred to in that way. So Milton's muse here is being Christianized. And if we think of the Trinity, it's likely that Milton is referring to the Spirit, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure, which is an idea that goes back to the prophets, the Old Testament prophets, that does prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure. In Milton, we hear it very strongly. There's an emphasis on interiority, that does prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure. What's more important is not the external worship of temples, but the internal worship of the heart. Of course, this is a much stronger sense in Milton's Puritan world, where the temples really are in the prophets. There's a sense that the temple worship is not what it should be because there is no upright heart and pure, but the temple is still maintained as an ideal. For Milton, the primary ideal here is the upright heart and pure. It struck me, for thou knowest, thou from the first was present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like sat brooding in the vast abyss. Oh, the holiest spirit appears like a dove, sat brooding on the vast abyss and made it pregnant. We've seen the sexual metaphor before, I think in L'Allegro nel Penseroso, of the heavens impregnating the earth, but here it's Christianized. What in me is dark illumined, what is low and raised, and support that to the height of this great argument, and we assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men. So again, if it were undergraduate time, I would take out the Old Testament and ask somebody to read the first few lines. And it doesn't say anything when what is the line? Somebody here, V'ruach Elokim mirachepet al pnei hamayim. What, I don't know, whatever. And the ruach of God, that's the literal Hebrew, and Milton is using, instead of, and he's for that literal Hebrew, he's saying, oh, spirit, is it justified in the Hebrew? That is philologically ruach. So the ruach is being transformed into spirit. Very careful translations of the Hebrew Bible will translate it as wind, kind of to push against this Christian, and that's also translation, to push against this very, very Christian interpretation, and to be more literal. Thou from the first was present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like sat brooding on the vast abyss. So the Holy Spirit is not in my Hebrew Tanakh. It's not in my Hebrew Old Testament. So here, let's go. We'll rewind back to our introduction about midrash. Here is a typical or a very striking example, the very first lines of the poem, through which Milton is taking the Hebraic story and Christianizing it. That is, at the very beginning, the Holy Spirit was present. At the very beginning, the Hebraic story was already, in some sense, Christian. So in this, that's filling in the gaps and taking the Old Testament story and pulling it into Milton's Christian perspective. So we've seen then in this invocation, competing conceptions of temporality, the competition between the Hebraic and the Greek, the ways in which Milton is, as I said earlier, Milton is not only defining the future of English poetry, he's defining the past of everything, of the world poetry in general. He will, for romantic readers, be the figure who inspires and changes them, but he also, in his backward glance, changes everything that came before him. So the competition between the Greek and the Hebraic, and here, and Milton's assertion of priority, things yet unattempted yet in prose or rhyme, and then also this sense of the Christian finally appropriating the Greek and the Hebrew. So all of these earlier affiliations, all of these earlier citations are assimilated into Milton's Christian vision. So I think that when we go back to it, we go back to lines 7 and 8, sing it heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd who first taught the chosen seed. In the beginning of the heaven and earth rose out of chaos. So that shepherd might start out in our Greek or Lycidas imagination is the speaker of, or the poet of Lycidas. When we get to the chosen seed, we think it's, of course, Moses. But by the time we get to the end of the invocation, we not only see, if we're good readers, we're good Christian readers, and we're trying to be that just to see what Milton is doing, not to become Christian, but to see what Milton is doing. By the time we've read it, we go back and we see that shepherd is also the figure of Jesus. We've read Lycidas, of course it is, right? After you read Lycidas, how could it not? We've already learned from Lycidas the shepherd is pastoral, Hebraic, and Christian. So that's our introduction. Let's just pause here and take a breath. I don't know how long this has been. Okay, I think what we'll do is we'll stop here now. This seems like a good place to stop. I may make one other video to talk about one of the first, I will do that, and I will make it separate, to talk about just one of the first metaphors that, or extended similes that Milton uses in Paradise Lost. Okay, Yalla, enjoy the poem.